In this video, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of an introduction to Data.Census.Gov. The first thing that I want to note is just the URL for this particular site, and it is just Data.Census.Gov. It'll default to this little CEDC information thing. If you enter Data.Census.Gov into your URL, this is where you will end up. So you don't need to remember that. And I will put a link into this page inside the VoiceThread in a little text box here. It's really important to note that the census page, so this is the sort of actually access to the information, the database itself, but actually Census.Gov, which is available here, also has lots of valuable information about the information that's available in Data.Census.Gov, along with quite a few tutorials for both beginners and even advanced data scientists who are looking to access and use the data that's available. So if you look at the list of programs and surveys, you can go to all surveys and programs here, you can see essentially the different surveys and programs that are being used to collect data that are going on. So there are over 130 surveys and programs that happen each year. And the biggest one is the American Community Survey. And that's just a survey of American households. So it asks people different kinds of information about, do you have kids in school? Are you employed? What's your salary? Things like that. And then a business survey, which is just asking businesses things like how many people are on your payroll? How big is your payroll? What were your total sales? Things like that. And that's the quarterly services survey. And so as you can imagine from the quarterly, that happens 4 times per year. But if you sort of scroll down here, you can really see just how much and different kinds of information is being captured here. So an annual survey of jails, survey of entrepreneurs, survey of public employment and payroll, American time use, right? So there's just an absolute ton of information that's available through the different kinds of the information on Census.gov. So it's not just different kinds of demographic information like how many people live in Tucson, or things like median income. It's really, really extensive. So it's really fun to keep it, to sort of recognize just how much information and is available and being collected. And it's really cool, actually, I think, that we have access to we live in a society that values access to information and data, and just as a member of that society, you have access to this for free. So I think that's really cool, and I wanted to sort of just flag that. Now, to be clear, we're really only going to be working with this Data.Census.Gov. And it'll give you access to a wide range of the already created tables and charts that compile the different kinds of data that we just talked about. But I did want to note that that's not the only information that's available from the census, or the only way that you can access the information from the census. In addition to the database, the Census Bureau actually also has an API that will allow you to go ahead and I'm going to click here. So different ways you have the sort of Census.gov, you have data profiles, tables and maps. These are the quick facts. But they also have just an API that allows you, data scientists and other researchers, to extract large sets of data in different formats. And then they also have tools for people to create their own tables using the microdata. And these last 2 functions are really outside the scope of this class, but I think it's important to note that those resources exist, especially if you are on the ISTA side of things. Using those 2 tools might actually be helpful for certain kinds of capstone projects. So let's go back to the exploring census data, and I want to show you the advanced search as a way of kind of introducing how the information in Data.Census.Gov is organized. So if you click here this is just a sort of simple search. It's sometimes if you're looking for really big picture, very popular kinds of data, you can just go ahead and enter, say, 2012 poverty, and it'll just tell you how many people were living in poverty in the United States in 2012. But most of the time, you're probably going to want to be extracting more specific kinds of data from the census data. And to do that, you're probably going to be needing to use advanced search. So when you click on advanced search, this is the place that you land. if you happened to have the table ID that you want to go to, like let's suppose that actually you've been working repeatedly with a really specific set of data, and you just wanted to go back to that table, you can go ahead and enter the table ID here and it'll take you directly to it. Most of the time, though, when you're using the advanced search function, you're actually going to be trying to figure out what kinds of data exist. So as you look around here, you can see that the filters, these are sort of the big picture filters that you might be able to use. Topics, geography, years, surveys, and codes. So let's talk a little bit about which each of these is. If you go to topics, this is kind of like, what's your question about, in a sense? Like, do you want to know, like big picture topics about, so maybe it's pertaining to business and the economy. Do you want to learn something about education, maybe about school districts or about a university spending, something like that? Maybe you want to know about employment, like big picture trends. Maybe you want to know about families and living arrangements, government information, like information about people's health, housing, income and poverty, populations and people, and race and ethnicity. Now, one of the things that's really tricky about this, and why one of the things that I tell people to do, is to make sure that you're really clicking through and exploring these topics before you ultimately decide on a particular filter that you're going to use. Now, so the reason I say that is because you might be interested in, let's say, how much money a particular industry spends on payroll. Like maybe you want to know how much does the airline industry spend on payroll? And if you were going to be talking about that, you'd want to be clicking on business and economy, probably thinking on like business and economy, expenditures, like expenses and expenditures, and then you might want to think about overall payroll, right? But it's really tempting sometimes when we ask questions about payroll, we have to think about whether we want to know like the payroll of a company or maybe something like average worker salary. And if you were thinking about average worker salary, then you'd want to actually be going into employment, right? And so you'd want to be thinking about like, like you could go into employment or industry or like, right? So these are kind of different things where depending on what you're interested in, you have to make sure that you're in the right filter. And it's not always very intuitive which which tables, like if you were thinking about average worker salary, it's not always intuitive whether it's going to be in employment or business and economy. And so sometimes you're just going to have to poke around and try a couple of different things. Similarly, same with like different kinds of questions that are about race. Sometimes you want to be thinking about populations and people, and sometimes you're actually going to want to be in the race and ethnicity in that particular filter. So one of the things that I just really encourage people to do is sort of poke around at all of the filters and do a lot of exploring before you settle on one that you're going to try, and then kind of have a couple of different options that you might want to be playing around with in the background. When you select a filter, it's going to add it to the bottom here. I'm going to go ahead and close that. So you can see that this is a selected filter. We'd be looking for information on Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. Like that's like going to be a topic about race. And then maybe we want to say like also like families and living arrangements. We could say, how many, so like information about children of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander descent, right? So as you add these filters to the bottom, that's actually going to be narrowing the number of tables that are going to pop up, right? And you can always keep track of, and it's in fact very important to keep track of those filters because sometimes we accidentally click on something or we're sort of like going back and editing different kinds of information, and you can actually add too many filters and then you end up with no results and you're like, but why? So it's really important to keep an eye on that. And then if you want to start over you can always like remove just one by clicking on the X, or if you want to go ahead and clear all of those and start over, you just click clear filters. So it's final and we'll clear all the filters that are going, and so you just say yes, clear selections. So it's a way to sort of play around with these different topical filters. When I'm looking for information on Data.Census.Gov, I almost always am starting with the sort of topics page right here. Like these are the ones that I use the most. If I'm looking for information about a specific place, then I'm also going to be using the geography filters, right? And so that means that you can look at like national level, different kinds of regions, state levels, county levels. Tracks, block group, and blocks are a little more difficult to use. That tends to be associated with different kinds of microdata. There are actually tutorials on how to figure out what kind of track or block group you're looking for, but it's oftentimes more useful in sort of different kinds of congressional data, and it's not something that we're going to be digging into as much here. But you can think that like there's information about school districts, secondary districts, unified school districts. Unified school districts are about elementary school, like they're a unified district of both elementary schools and secondary schools. You got congressional districts, that's going to be voting regions, thinking about different kinds of, just different ways of carving up spaces. One of the things that I really want to draw your attention to is this metropolitan statistical area. So if you're thinking about a big place like Phoenix, right? So we know that there's the city of Phoenix. But if you were to talk about the Phoenix metropolitan area, that's not just the city of Phoenix. That's also going to be places like Scottsdale and Chandler and Glendale and Peoria, right? So we know that sort of Phoenix has lots of little kind of sub regions, and so you might say, like, you could imagine that if you went to New York and you grew up in Scottsdale, and somebody said, so where are you from? You might not say Scottsdale, you might say, well, I'm from Phoenix, because what you're talking about is just sort of like the bigger area. And so a lot of times when people are interested in sort of like information about, say, Houston, what they're really interested is actually not about like the sort of tiny like part of Houston, which is Houston proper, but like the Houston metropolitan area. And so this is going to be a way for you to sort of capture that information about larger urban and suburban areas. And so you're going to, like, oftentimes when you're looking for information, that's going to be really important. The way to access that, so you can click on metropolitan statistical area, and it's going to list them all alphabetically here. That's really annoying to have to like scroll through all of them. And so it does give you the option to search. So if I wanted to do the Phoenix metropolitan area, I could just start typing Phoenix. There we go. And so now we have a couple of different options here. It's interesting that it kind of carves it up into different ways. But usually, depending on what you're looking for, oh, whoops, I clicked away and so it went away here. I'll do it again. You can see how there's actually like two like Phoenix Mesa Scottsdale AZ metro area and Phoenix Mesa Glendale AZ area. They just kind of bisect Phoenix into a couple of different areas, and so it's kind of odd the way that ends up happening. But it's important to point out that this is a way of like accessing different kinds of information about a metropolitan area, and it's oftentimes something that you're going to be looking for. So I like to flag that for students, especially since if like a question is asking you about like, well, how many kids are enrolled in Tucson schools. A lot of times you're actually going to be more interested in the Tucson metropolitan area than you are just about like the city of Tucson proper. So it's something to kind of keep in mind. Years is actually quite straightforward. You just like click information, like which year are you looking for? And sometimes we're looking for years and sometimes not, so it can be helpful to do that. Now the surveys, these are the list of, the ACS is the American Community Survey, so that was the biggest one that they do, and they do these in sort of like 5-year estimates. That's like, these are just different ways of sampling information. So if you happen to have known that the piece of information that you wanted was in a particular kind of survey, you could use this to scroll through and identify the specific survey that you wanted or the specific program. It's very, very rarely the case that is a helpful way of accessing the information. Codes is even more specific. I've included a link to the NAICS industry codes, which is actually a really helpful way of understanding how the information in the U.S. Census is organized. And a lot of these other codes, like products and service codes, actually work very similarly. So if you kind of have a sense of how the NAICS numbers work, you can kind of get a sense of how these like product and service codes and commodity codes work. And so these are just different ways to code like different kinds of stuff, right? So here we go. We've got product and service codes. You can talk about new automobiles, including crossovers, used automobiles. There are motorcycles, right? So into, like utility trailers, ATVs, right? So if you have questions about stuff, it's really likely that you're either going to want a commodity code or a product and service code. And that's like something where you can kind of look through. If you're looking for information that's actually that specific, I strongly recommend, rather than poking around in the codes, but like going into this function here, find a filter. So let's say I wanted to find information related to vaccines. That could be something that's on everybody's minds right now. So I just type in vaccine and I wait for it to think a little bit. And now I can see that there are a couple of different product and service codes that are associated with vaccines. So vaccines and laboratory diagnostic reagents, vaccines, toxoids, antigens, excluding allergens for human use, right? So there are different things that you might be interested in, and you could use that. So if you've got a really, really, really specific kind of thing that you would like to study, I think it's actually really helpful to use the find a filter, simply because that ends up being a much more efficient way of finding the different filters that are related to that, as opposed to like having to poke through and literally like search through the different codes themselves. So that's just give you a little bit of a sense of how the Data.Census.Gov is organized. As you go through the search exercises, again, just make sure that you're keeping track of the filters that are popping up on the bottom, keeping track of like what you're searching and why. I would recommend not going to like including too many of them at first, because sometimes you can get so specific that you actually accidentally end up leaving some important information out. So you just kind of want to keep around with that. I also strongly recommend, again, making sure that you're doing a good job of kind of clicking through and looking at all of the different options before you ultimately select one to try, and then going back and seeing about some of the other ones that you might have wanted to look into, because as I said, it's not always super intuitive whether you'd be looking at something that would be, say, part of business and economy or employment. And until you've been doing it for a really long time, it's easy to sort of just assume that you're thinking about something that would be in this topic when actually it would be in this topic, and then you end up leaving something out. So good luck, you guys, and let me know if you have any questions about the sample searches.